The day Eliza Calloway buried the last piece of her heart in the red Wyoming dirt, she swore on her mother's grave that no man would ever get close enough to hurt her again. And for 3 years, she had kept that promise with the same iron grip she kept on everything else she owned. The year was 1874, and the town of Clearwater Crossing sat like a stubborn weed at the foot of the Absaroka Mountains, the kind of settlement that had sprung up fast on account of the silver veins threading through the rock above it and had no intention of dying quietly. It was a town built on ambition and desperation in equal parts, full of men who had come west to remake themselves and women who had come because they had no other choice. The main street was a single wide ribbon of packed earth that turned to soup every spring and cracked like old pottery every August, flanked by a general store, a livery, a saloon that never fully closed, a small church that was always under full, and a handful of other enterprises that clung to respectability with varying degrees of success. Eliza ran the boarding house on the east end of that street, a 2-story timber frame building with a patched roof and a front porch that leaned slightly to the left but had never fallen. She had inherited it from her aunt, a sharp-tongued woman named Dorothea, who had died of a chest ailment 2 winters back, and she had turned it from a barely functioning collection of dusty rooms into the cleanest, most orderly establishment in Clearwater Crossing. She did it herself, mostly. She cooked, she cleaned, she kept the ledger, she replaced the window glass when drunken cowboys put elbows through it, and she managed her 4 current boarders with the calm authority of a woman who had long since stopped waiting for anyone to do anything for her. Those boarders were a retired assayer named Mr. Hopper, who smelled of pipe tobacco and old maps, a young schoolteacher called Miss Fenwick, who was terrified of mice and everything else the frontier had to offer, a quiet, itinerant preacher named Brother Thomas, who paid on time and asked for nothing, and a prospector called Dutch, who paid late and asked for everything. She tolerated all of them. She did not particularly like any of them, but she was fair, and fairness was the thing she prized above all other qualities in the world. She was 27 years old. With dark auburn hair, she kept pinned back in a practical knot and green eyes that had learned a long time ago to give nothing away. She was not a small woman, not fragile in any way the word usually implied. She was lean from hard work, with strong hands that had kneaded bread and hauled water, and once broken a man's nose when he had tried to grab her in her own kitchen. She wore plain dark dresses and sturdy boots, and she did not own anything that could be described as decorative, except a small blue glass brooch that had belonged to her mother, which she kept pinned at her collar every single day like an anchor. The story of why she had stopped trusting men with her heart was not one she told, but it was one Clearwater Crossing had assembled for itself from pieces over the years. There had been a husband, Thomas Calloway, a handsome man with easy charm and a talent for promises he never kept. They had married in Missouri when Eliza was 22, and he had brought her west on the strength of those promises. And then he had spent 3 years gambling away everything they earned and chasing the particular kind of excitement that lived at the bottom of a whiskey bottle and in the beds of women who were not his wife. He had left finally on a Tuesday morning without a note, taking the money from the lockbox under the floorboard and leaving behind a debt to the hardware merchant and 2 unpaid months of livery fees. She had heard later, through the wandering grapevine of the Western Territories, that he had made it to Nevada, and then made nothing of himself there either. She had not grieved. She had simply worked and rebuilt and made herself into a person who did not need rescuing, which was its own kind of armor. So she was not, on that October morning when everything began to change, in any frame of mind to be interested in the large, dark-haired man who rode into Clearwater Crossing on a dun-colored horse with a dead elk lashed behind him and more mountain in him than most men carried in their entire lives. She was sweeping the front porch when he came down the main street, and she noticed him the way you notice a weather change before the clouds arrive. Something in the air shifted slightly. He was enormous. That was the first word her mind offered, and she was annoyed by how accurate it was. He was well over 6 feet, broad through the chest and shoulders in a way that suggested not the pumped vanity of a man who lifted things to be seen lifting them, but the genuine architectural mass of someone who had spent years hauling timber and fighting mountain conditions with his bare hands. His hair was dark brown and fell past his collar, slightly unkempt in the way that suggested he cut it himself when he thought of it, and sometimes forgot to think of it. He had a beard, full but not unruly, and beneath it a jaw that could have been used to split kindling. His coat was oilskin and worn, his boots were made for hard country, and he rode with the loose, easy confidence of a man who had been on horseback since before he could properly remember. He pulled up in front of the livery and stepped down, and even the act of stepping down from a horse looked different when he did it, deliberate, unhurried, as though the ground was honored by the contact. She swept her porch and looked away and told herself she had noticed him only because strangers were always worth noting in a town where strangers either meant commerce or trouble. She did not know yet which one he was. His name was Colt Bridger, and she learned it an hour later when he knocked on the front door of the boarding house with his hat in his hands and asked in a voice that was low and unhurried, like water moving over stones, whether she had a room available. She looked at him through the screen door and assessed him the way she assessed everyone, quickly, thoroughly, without warmth. He looked back at her with dark brown eyes that were steady and direct without being aggressive. He did not smile unnecessarily. She appreciated that more than she would have admitted. "Room is $1.50 a week," she said. "Includes breakfast and dinner. You feed yourself at midday. No gambling, no drinking on the premises, no visitors after 8 in the evening. You break something, you pay for it." "Understood," he said. "How long are you planning to stay?" He thought about it genuinely, which she noticed. Most men answered that question with false confidence in one direction or another. "Through the winter, most likely," he said. "I have business with the mine operator up on the North Ridge. When that's done, I'll likely move on." "What kind of business?" "Timber contract. They need shoring beams for the lower tunnels. I have a cutting operation about 12 miles up the mountain." She studied him a moment longer, then unlatched the screen door. "Rooms on the second floor, East End," she said. "I'll need a week in advance." He reached into his coat without any theater about it and produced the money in exact change. She took it, showed him the room, told him where the washroom was, and left him to it. She went back downstairs and stood in her kitchen for a moment listening to the sound of his boots overhead, heavy and slow, and she breathed in and breathed out and reminded herself that a paying boarder was a paying boarder and nothing more. His name was Colt Bridger, and she did not intend to know anything else about him. The first week passed in the ordinary rhythm of the boarding house. He was, she had to admit, an exceptionally undemanding boarder. He came to breakfast on time, ate well without complaining or commenting, cleared his own plate to the kitchen, nodded good morning to the other boarders without drawing them into unnecessary conversation, and was gone before 7. He came back in the evenings, ate dinner with the same economy, and went to his room at a reasonable hour. He did not drink on the premises, he did not gamble, he did not break anything. He tracked in less mud than any of the other 4 despite working in the mountains all day, which she found quietly remarkable. The other boarders were fascinated by him. Mr. Hopper attempted conversation every morning and received polite but brief responses. Miss Fenwick blushed whenever he was in the room, which was so predictable Eliza found it almost tedious. Brother Thomas regarded him with the wary respect a small man gives a large one who has not yet established himself as friendly. Dutch, who was constitutionally incapable of silence, had somehow extracted from Colt the information that he was 32 years old, had been born in Tennessee, and had come west at 17 with his father who had since passed away, and that he had been working the mountain timber trade for going on 10 years. Dutch shared all of this with Eliza over his breakfast one morning with the transparent hope of sparking something in her expression. Her expression remained exactly as it was. "Quiet man," Dutch observed. "Good quality in a boarder," she said, and refilled his coffee. It was in the second week that the first thing happened, the thing that lodged a small splinter in the careful, smooth wall she kept between herself and other people. She had gone out early to get eggs from the widow hatcher, who kept chickens 2 lots over, and she was coming back across the side yard when she heard the sound, high, thin, frightened, and she saw that Fenwick's gray tabby cat had somehow gotten itself up onto the roof of the woodshed and was frozen there in the cold morning air, absolutely unwilling to come down. Miss Fenwick was standing in the yard below in her night wrapper, making the distressed sounds of a woman who is cold and frightened for her cat, and had no idea what to do about either condition. Eliza set down her basket and was calculating the logistics of getting a ladder when Colt appeared from the direction of the stable, where he had been saddling his horse. He took in the situation without any fuss, crossed the yard, and went up the side of the woodshed like it was nothing. Hand over hand up the corner post, boots finding purchase with easy certainty, all those considerable muscles engaged without visible effort. He reached the cat, and this was the part Eliza found herself actually watching. He did not grab at it. He crouched on the sloping roof with a natural balance that was almost startling, and he put out one large hand, knuckles first, and waited. And after a moment the cat put its head against his hand, and he gathered it up against his chest, and came back down the same way he had gone up, one-handed, holding the cat tucked against him like it was the most ordinary thing in the world. He handed the cat to the weeping Miss Fenwick, said, "There you are," in that low, untroubled voice, and went back to finish saddling his horse. Eliza picked up her egg basket and went inside and did not think about it. She thought about it through the entire process of making breakfast. It was a small thing. It was nothing. A man had gotten a cat off a roof. It required exactly no reassessment of anything. But there was something in the way he had waited for the cat to come to him, rather than simply seizing it, that kept returning to her in quiet moments. There was patience in it. There was a kind of respect she had not expected from a man built the way he was built, the kind of man who could have simply taken what he wanted and relied on size to manage any argument. She filed it away and told herself it was an observation, not a feeling. The second thing happened on a Thursday afternoon when she was having a dispute with the hardware merchant, a florid, red-faced man named Griggs, who had been trying for years to convince her that the prices he charged her for supplies were fair, when in fact they were approximately 15% higher than what he charged the male business owners on the same street. She had figured this out in her first month of running the boarding house and had been conducting a steady, exhaustive campaign of documentation and confrontation ever since, which Griggs found infuriating and which she found clarifying. On this particular Thursday, she needed a new length of stovepipe and a set of hinges for the cellar door, and Griggs was quoting her a price that was, once again, built on the assumption that she had not done arithmetic. "That is not the price you charged Mr. Hopper for the same pipe length last spring," she said, with her hands flat on the counter and her green eyes level. "I have the receipt. He showed it to me himself." Griggs went redder. "Hopper's a regular customer." "I have been buying supplies from this store for 2 years, Mr. Griggs. By any reasonable definition, that makes me a regular customer." "It's a different grade of pipe." "It is the same pipe. It is sitting on the same shelf it was sitting on when you quoted Mr. Hopper's price. Would you like to show me the invoice that demonstrates a different grade?" He could not, because there was no such invoice. His face was doing something complicated. Behind her, the door of the hardware store opened, and she felt rather than saw someone enter, and she did not take her eyes off Griggs. "I'll tell you what, Mrs. Calloway," Griggs said, dropping his voice to the register men used when they wanted to sound reasonable, but actually wanted to be done with an argument they were losing. "I'll give you a fair price, but you need to understand that operating costs—" "I understand operating costs precisely," she said. "I operate a business. The price Mr. Hopper paid for this pipe length was 40 cents. I will pay 40 cents. There was a brief silence in which Griggs looked past her at whoever had come in behind her, and something in his expression shifted almost imperceptibly. "Fine," he said. 40 cents. She paid and gathered her supplies and turned, and found Colt standing just inside the door, his arms folded across that massive chest, his expression entirely neutral. He had clearly been there for enough of the exchange to understand it. She waited to see if he was going to say something patronizing, something like, "Good for you," or "Well handled," the kind of praise that a man offered a woman when she'd done something he considered slightly above her station. He said nothing at all. He just stepped aside to let her through the door, and there was nothing in his face but simple courtesy. She walked home and found herself, for the first time in a very long time, smiling at no one in particular. The cold deepened through October into November. The Absaroka Range turned white along the ridgelines and then lower, and the wind came down off the peaks with a serious intent that rattled the boarding house windows and made the front porch lean more dramatically to the left. Eliza banked the fires and aired out the extra quilts and laid in more wood than she thought she would need, because that was how she operated. She prepared for more than seemed necessary and was always quietly glad she had. Colt was working long days up on the mountain, coming back after dark most evenings with sawdust in his hair and the cold locked deep in the fabric of his coat, and he ate his dinner with the focused attention of a man burning through enormous amounts of fuel. She had started without making a decision to do so, leaving a covered plate for him on the back of the stove when he was late, because it cost her nothing, and wasting food was something she found morally objectionable. He always brought the plate back to the kitchen cleaned, and once she found a small bundle of firewood stacked neatly beside the back door that had not been there before, and when she asked him about it, he said only that he had some offcuts that would otherwise go to waste. She did not thank him effusively. She said, "That was considerate of you," in her normal tone, and he said, "Think nothing of it," and that was the whole of it. But she was noticing things. She was noticing, against her better judgment and her considerable willpower, that he was the kind of man she had not actually believed existed. Not in the way she had once believed when she was younger and had not yet been educated by experience, not in the fairy story way, the prince on a horse way, but in a quieter, more durable way that was somehow more disturbing. He was consistent. He was honest in the small daily ways that cost nothing dramatically, but added up over time to a kind of character. He did not perform kindness. He simply exercised it when it was required and moved on without expectation. He treated her with the same directness and respect he would have given any person conducting business with him, which sounds like nothing unless you have spent years on the receiving end of the particular condescension that most men in 1874 Wyoming applied to women who had the temerity to own things and make decisions. One evening in mid-November, she was at the front desk doing the ledger when he came in and, instead of going straight upstairs, paused by the doorway of the small sitting room where she worked. "I don't want to interrupt," he said. "You haven't interrupted. You've only stopped in the doorway." She kept her eyes on the ledger. "There's a loose board on the second step," he said. "I noticed it's getting worse. I have the tools and the materials. I could fix it tomorrow morning before I go up if you want." She looked up then. His expression was what it usually was, open, straightforward, without subtext. "What would you charge?" she asked. "Nothing." "I pay for labor," she said, because she did. "You fed me a hot dinner at 9 at night when you didn't have to," he said simply. "Call it even." She looked at him for a moment. "The step needs to be fixed properly, not just hammered flat. The board underneath it is also compromised." "I know," he said. I looked at it. "Fine," she said. "Thank you." He nodded and went upstairs. She looked back at her ledger and the numbers blurred for a moment, and she blinked them back into focus and was irritated at herself for the blurring. He fixed the step and the board beneath it and the two other boards he found while he was at it, and he did it cleanly and well, and she inspected it afterward because she always inspected things and there was nothing to find fault with. The trouble, if you could call it trouble, which was a word that fit poorly when what she actually meant was something warmer and more frightening, came to a head on a Saturday night in late November when the temperature dropped to something that had no business being visited on any living creature, and a howling wind came down the mountain and shook the boarding house from its foundation to its rafters. She was up at 2 in the morning because the wind had torn a section of the roof shingles loose over the back bedroom and the cold was getting in, and she had gone up to assess the damage. What she found was a gap in the roofline about 3 feet wide, and through it, the black Wyoming sky and the merciless cold. She stood looking at it with her lantern raised and did the calculation. She could not fix this herself, not in the dark and the wind and at this temperature. And for the first time in longer than she could easily remember, she felt the particular helplessness of a problem she could not immediately solve alone. She did not hear him come up behind her, which was impressive given his size, and when he said, "Mrs. Calloway," in a low voice, she turned quickly, her heart banging against her ribs. He was in his undershirt and trousers and boots, his dark hair loose around his face, and he looked even larger without the coat, the breadth of his shoulders and chest thrown into absolute relief by the cold light of her lantern. "Sorry," he said at once, because he had clearly startled her. "I heard the crash, thought something was wrong." She steadied her breath. "Section of roof came loose," she said, pointing upward. He raised his eyes to the gap and studied it for a moment. Without another word, he went to his room and came back dressed, and he spent the next hour, in the dark, in the cold, on a roof in a Wyoming windstorm, fixing her building. She passed tools up to him through the window and held the lantern as high as she could and directed the light where it was needed, and she did not ask him to be careful because he was clearly not a man who needed that said to him. She heard the methodical sounds of him working, the steady hammer blows, the scrape of shingles being positioned, and there was something in the reliability of those sounds in the dark, and the wind that did something to her chest that she was not yet prepared to name. When he came back inside, he was breathing hard, and his hands were raw red from the cold, and she took those hands and held them between her own without thinking about it first, chafing heat back into them, and she felt him go very still. She released his hands and took a step back. "I'll make tea," she said, because she needed something to do with herself. "You don't have to." "I know I don't have to," she said. "Sit down." He sat at the kitchen table and she made tea and brought it to him and sat across from him, and they drank in silence for a while and listened to the wind work itself out, and it was the most companionable silence she had experienced in 3 years. She was acutely aware of it, which made her uncomfortable, which made her speak. "Why did you come west?" she asked. She did not usually ask personal questions. She felt the strangeness of asking one. He wrapped both large hands around the mug. "Same reason most people did, I suppose. Felt too small where I was." He paused. "That sounds like a poor reason." "It sounds like an honest one." He looked at her steadily. In the low kitchen light, with his hair down and his face unguarded in the way it only was when he thought no performance was required, she was going to allow herself the word, just privately, beautiful. In the raw, architectural way, mountains were beautiful. "What about you?" he asked. "My aunt left me the building," she said. "I had nothing better." "And now?" she considered. "Now I have something I built myself. That's better than nothing better." "Yes," he said, and there was something in the way he said it, simple and sure, that meant he understood exactly what she meant, not just the surface of it, but the deep bone pride of a person who had made something with their own hands out of a difficult set of circumstances. She went to bed an hour later and lay in the dark, listening to the wind die down, and thought about the way he had gone still when she held his hands. And she told herself it was nothing, and she was beginning to understand that she was lying to herself. December came in cold and glittering. The mountain above the town wore a full white coat now, and the mine was cutting its hours because the access road iced over after noon, and the town settled into the particular tight-lipped endurance of a western settlement in winter. People did not venture out unnecessarily. Wood was rationed. Conversation at the boarding house dinner table became more elaborate as everyone sought to fill the long evenings. Colt was around more, which was the direct consequence of the mine-cutting hours and was therefore not his fault. But Eliza found herself having to manage the increased exposure with greater deliberateness. He did not impose himself. He sat in the sitting room in the evenings and read. He had a modest collection of books that he had carried in his saddlebag, which she found immediately interesting. Or he worked on small repairs around the house that she had not asked him to do, but found herself unable to object to because they all needed doing. One afternoon, she came downstairs from making the beds and found him at the kitchen table with her stovepipe, the one she'd bought at Griggs's, and he was in the process of realigning a joint that had been slightly off and leaking smoke for weeks without her having had the time to address it. "That needed doing," she admitted, stopping in the kitchen doorway. "I noticed the smoke backing up a little," he said. He had his sleeves rolled to the elbow, and his forearms were extraordinary, corded with muscle and sinew, darkened by years of outdoor work, and she looked at them for one unavoidable second and then looked at the stovepipe. "Shouldn't take long. You'll have soot on you." He glanced at his already soot-darkened hands. "Already do." She found herself smiling. She tried to stop it and mostly failed. "There's hot water on the back burner when you're done." "Appreciated." She busied herself with the afternoon bread, and he worked on the stovepipe, and they existed in the same warm kitchen for 2 hours without it being awkward, which was something she had not managed with another person in so long that the ease of it alarmed her. They talked occasionally, about small things, practical things, the weather and the mine schedule, and whether Dutch was likely to find anything worth finding in his claim before the spring thaw. He was easy to talk to in the way that genuinely intelligent people were easy to talk to, which was that he listened fully before he responded. And when he disagreed with something, she said he said so plainly and without apology, which she respected enormously. At one point she said something about the mine operator, a man named Hadwick, and the way he had been treating the workers who came through town, underpaying them and then charging them for equipment rental until there was nothing left. And she said it with the contained heat of someone who has thought about a specific injustice a great deal. Colt set down his wrench and was quiet for a moment. "I know," he said. "Most of those men have no recourse. They came out here with nothing and they're leaving with nothing after a season of hard labor. Someone should do something about it." He looked at her with those steady, dark eyes. "What would you do?" "Document it," she said immediately. "The way I document Griggs's pricing. Numbers don't argue. If every man who came through this town kept a record of what he was owed versus what he was paid, Hadwick would have no leg to stand on in any court. Getting men to keep records," he said slowly, "who have no writing. Then someone else keeps the records for them." She stopped. She had not actually articulated this plan before, she realized. It had been sitting in her head, and it had just walked out of its own accord. "That's not my business," she added. "It could be," he said, "if you wanted it to be." She looked at him. He held her gaze without pressure, without the expectant hovering of a man trying to lead her somewhere. He was simply offering a thought and leaving it where it lay. "You are a different kind of man," she said before she could stop herself. He did not preen. He did not ask what she meant in the fishing way people asked things they already knew the answer to. He just said quietly, "I've been lucky enough to know good people. It shows up eventually." She went back to her bread, and her heart was doing something inconvenient, and she kneaded the dough with probably more force than was strictly required. It was Dutch who precipitated the next crisis, which was no surprise to anyone who knew Dutch. He had taken on a debt with a card player named Rourke, who operated out of the back room of the saloon, and the debt had grown through a combination of Dutch's optimism and Rourke's sleight of hand to an amount that Dutch could not pay. Rourke was not a violent man precisely, but he employed a man who was a heavy-set enforcer called simply Marks, who had a fondness for demonstrating consequences in ways that were visible to everyone. Eliza learned about all of this on a Wednesday morning when Dutch came to breakfast with a bruise across his left cheekbone and a look of determined nonchalance that convinced no one. "What happened?" she asked, setting down his coffee. "Walked into a door," Dutch said. "You walked into Mark's," said Mr. Hopper, who knew everything that happened in Clearwater Crossing before it happened. Dutch's nonchalance collapsed. He stared at his eggs. "It's being handled," he said. "What's being handled?" Eliza asked. "I owe Rourke some money. I'll have it when I pull the next load from my claim." "When will that be?" "Spring, maybe." Eliza sat down. Marks did not, as a rule, wait until spring. She looked at Dutch and felt the complicated feeling she always felt about him. He was irresponsible and frustrating, and he perpetually made her life harder, but he was also under her roof and therefore, by the rules she had made for herself, her concern. Colt was listening from across the table. She watched him process the situation with that quiet deliberateness he had. After breakfast, when Dutch had shuffled out with the optimism of a man who was very good at not thinking about problems until they arrived, Colt stayed behind with his coffee cup. "He's going to get hurt worse than a bruised cheek," Colt said. "Yes," she agreed. "I could speak with Rourke." She looked at him. "What would that accomplish?" He was quiet for a moment, and she understood that what he was offering was not speech precisely, but the particular communication that happened when a man of his size and self-possession entered a room and made clear, without raising his voice or lifting a hand, that a situation was going to be resolved differently than currently planned. It was a quality she had seen in very few men, and it was not the same as aggression. It was something older and more settled, the gravity of a person who had never needed to prove himself, and therefore never needed to threaten. "Let me come with you," she said. He looked at her, and she could see the debate happen and resolve itself in about 4 seconds. "All right," he said. They went to the saloon that afternoon. Rourke was a thin, careful man with a professional smile that never reached his eyes, and he received them in the back room with the wariness of a man who had been presented with 2 unknown quantities. Eliza laid out the situation in the precise and organized way she laid out everything. Dutch's account of the debt, the discrepancy in the original figure he claimed versus the amount Rourke was now citing, the question of documentation. Rourke began to say something dismissive, and then Colt shifted in his chair in a way that occupied perhaps 6 more inches of space than it had before, and Rourke's eyes moved to him and something reconsidered behind them. The negotiation took 40 minutes. Dutch paid a reduced figure, the original debt without the added interest that Rourke had attached without agreement, and the matter was closed. Marks was not present for the conversation, which had not been accidental. Walking back to the boarding house, Eliza said, "You did not say much in there." "You said everything that needed saying," Colt replied. "I just sat in the room." "You were rather more than sitting," she said dryly. He glanced at her and the corner of his mouth moved, just barely, just a fraction, in what she had come to recognize as his version of a full smile. "Was that the first time you've done something like that?" "No," she said, "but it's the first time I've had backup." The word was out before she had decided to say it, and it hung between them in the cold afternoon air with more weight than she had intended. She did not take it back. She let it lie where it had fallen. He said nothing, which was the right response, but she saw the effect of it in him, a small loosening somewhere, a warmth entering those dark eyes that had not been there before, and she walked the rest of the way to the boarding house, aware that something between them had shifted, and that she had let it shift, and that she was not certain whether that terrified or relieved her. The Christmas season came to Clearwater Crossing with the awkward festivity of a frontier town that was trying hard and working with limited materials. Mrs. Palmer at the church organized a dinner that was attended by nearly the whole settlement, and there was a tree in the saloon that the barkeep decorated with tin stars and colored paper, and the children of the 4 families in town were in a state of excited anticipation that was entirely out of proportion to what they were likely to receive, which was the best thing about children. Eliza baked for the church dinner because she always did, and she set the boarding house table with the extra candles she kept for this time of year, and she found herself making a pan of gingerbread that she had not made since she was a child in Missouri, following the memory of her mother's hands folding the dough. It was while she was doing this, late on a December evening, that Colt came into the kitchen and stopped. "That smell," he said, and there was something unguarded in his voice that she had not heard before. "Gingerbread," she said. He sat down at the table without being invited, which he had never done before, and she did not object to it. "My mother made that," he said simply. "On Christmas, every year." She set the pan in the oven and wiped her hands and sat down across from him. "Tell me about her." He looked at the table for a moment. "She was a determined woman," he said. "Tennessee woman, small, could outwork most men I've ever met. She died when I was 15. Fever." He paused. "I don't talk about her much." "You don't have to," she said. I know." He met her eyes. "I want to." And so he told her about his mother, and she told him about hers, and they sat at the kitchen table long after the gingerbread came out of the oven and cooled, and they talked about Tennessee and Missouri and the particular grief of losing a parent when you were still in the process of needing one, and the table between them was warm and golden in the lamplight, and at some point she realized that the careful distance she had maintained for 3 years had been slowly, gently, thoroughly dissolved over the course of 2 months by a mountain man who had fixed her step and gotten a cat off a roof and sat in a saloon card room without saying a word and talked about his mother in a voice that held everything he was. She was not ready to say any of this, but she was beginning to understand she was going to have to. It was on the day before Christmas that he gave her the brooch. Not the blue glass one she wore every day. He had noticed that one and understood without being told that it was not a thing you touched or commented on. This was something else. She found it in the morning on the kitchen table, wrapped in a square of red cloth, with a note in his handwriting, steady, unpretentious cursive, that said only, "For your collection, if you want one." She unwrapped it. It was a small pin in the shape of a pine bough, made from some silver-colored metal and set with 2 tiny dark green stones that caught the light. It was not elaborate. It was not valuable in any commercial sense. It was the most careful thing anyone had given her in years, because it showed that he had been paying attention, Attention not to what a woman in general might want, but to what she specifically was. She stood in the kitchen with it in her hand for a long moment. Then she went to find him. He was in the stable behind the boarding house brushing his horse, and she came through the stable door with the brooch in her palm, and he turned and saw her face, and whatever he saw there made him go very still, the brush arrested mid-stroke. "Thank you," she said, and her voice was steady but only just. "You're welcome," he said. "Why?" she asked. She needed to understand. She needed to hear it in words. He set down the brush. He took his time, because he always took his time with things that mattered. "Because you're the most capable person I have ever met," he said, "and also the loneliest. And those two things don't have to be together." She felt her throat close. She looked at the brooch in her hand. "I haven't trusted anyone in a long time," she said. It came out without decoration, without protective irony. Just the fact of it, laid bare. "I know," he said. "I'm not asking you to trust me all at once. I'm not asking you for anything. I just wanted you to have something that wasn't required." He paused. "You do everything because it's necessary. I wanted to give you something that was just extra." She crossed the stable and stood in front of him, which required tilting her head back at an angle to hold his gaze. And she looked at him, really looked at him without the shield, and what she found there was exactly what had been there all along: steadiness, patience, something that was absolutely and entirely hers to choose. She pinned the pine bough brooch beside the blue glass one at her collar, and she said, "I would like to have dinner with you, not at the boarding house table with Dutch and Hopper and everyone else, just the two of us." The quiet joy that moved through his expression was the most beautiful thing she had seen in years. "Yes," he said, "I'd like that." They had dinner on Christmas Eve at the small table in the back of the kitchen, just the two of them, after the other boarders had gone to the church social. She cooked the best meal she could make from what December in Wyoming provided, and he brought a bottle of decent wine that he had acquired from somewhere and would not say how. And they ate and talked, and somewhere in the middle of the evening, she reached across the table and put her hand over his, and he turned his hand over and held hers. And that was all. Nothing dramatic, nothing precipitous, just her hand in his great warm one, and the particular safety of it was so sudden and so total that it shocked her. She did not cry. She was not a woman who cried easily. But her eyes went bright, and she looked down at the table for a moment, and he did not ask what was wrong, because he understood that nothing was wrong, that this was the opposite of wrong, that this was the feeling of something mending. They sat like that for a long time, and the fire burned down, and the wind came off the mountain and moved around the walls of the building but could not get in. And it was Christmas Eve in Clearwater Crossing, Wyoming, 1874, and Eliza Calloway was, for the first time in a very long time, not alone. January brought the hardest winter the Absarokas had delivered in a decade, and Clearwater Crossing hunkered down and endured it with grim frontier determination. The mine suspended operations entirely for 3 weeks when the North Access Road became impassable even for the draft horses, and the town turned in on itself in the way towns did in deep winter. More arguments over nothing, more whiskey, more of the particular tension that came from too many people in too small a number of warm spaces. Colt was effectively grounded with the mine shut down, and so he turned his energy to the things around the boarding house that wanted doing and to the small timber enterprise he ran on a more modest scale, selling cut wood to the town's residents, which in January was not a luxury but a survival item. He spent his mornings out with the horse and a sledge, cutting and hauling, and his afternoons doing various repairs and improvements that the boarding house had needed for years. He and Eliza worked alongside each other in the easy way they had discovered in December, talking and sometimes not talking, and the relationship between them was something that the other boarders watched with the fascinated attention people gave to something they couldn't quite name but knew was significant. Miss Fenwick asked Eliza about it one afternoon when they were in the kitchen together, in the tentative way Fenwick asked everything. "Are you and Mr. Bridger? That is to say, I couldn't help but notice." "We are friends," Eliza said. "Right," said Fenwick, in the tone of someone who knew a careful answer when they heard one. Eliza thought about it that night. Were they friends? The word was accurate but insufficient. They had been spending their evenings in the sitting room, she with her ledger, he with his book. And the conversation that came and went between them was the kind that developed between people who had established mutual trust, which was its own slow miracle. He had told her about the years after his father died, the years alone on the mountain, the particular loneliness of a life built on self-sufficiency that had never been a choice so much as a necessity. She had told him about Thomas Calloway, not the sanitized version she gave herself, but the real one. The hope she'd had, the specific moments when she'd known it was wrong and had talked herself out of knowing, because the alternative was too frightening to face. He had listened without offering easy comfort, which she appreciated. He did not say, "Not all men," or "You're better off," or any of the things that were technically true but missed the point. He said, "You trusted yourself before anyone else. That's why you survived it." And he had said it like it was a fact, not a comfort, like it was something he had simply observed to be true. That was when she understood she was in love with him. She did not announce this to herself dramatically. It arrived the way the recognition of something already there always arrives, not as a new thing, but as the acknowledgement of something you had been looking at sideways for weeks, and now were finally looking at directly. She was in love with Colt Bridger, mountain man, timber trader, reader of books, fixer of roofs and stovepipes, man who waited for cats to come to him, man who sat in saloons like a mountain at rest, man who had noticed she was lonely and had not tried to fix it, but had simply made himself a presence in it, slowly and without agenda. She was terrified. She was not going to let that stop her. The opportunity presented itself on a Friday evening when they were the only two people in the sitting room, Hopper and Dutch having gone to the saloon and Fenwick having gone to help with a church quilting project, and Brother Thomas being wherever Brother Thomas went when he was not at the boarding house. The fire was good, the room was warm, and Colt was reading and she was pretending to do the accounts but had not written a number in 20 minutes. "I need to tell you something," she said. He looked up from his book, set it down on his knee, waited. "I have been in this house for 2 years telling myself that what I needed was to be sufficient unto myself," she said. She was looking at the middle distance, at the wall, not at him, because she needed to get through this without the distraction of his face. "That's not wrong. I do believe it is necessary to be sufficient unto yourself, but I think I have been using it as a reason to not want anything." She paused. "And that is a different thing. And it is cowardly. And I am not, generally speaking, a coward." She heard him breathe, heard the small shift of his weight in the chair. "I'm in love with you," she said. There. It was out. She let herself look at him. His face was open in a way she had never seen it, not the steady composure of his daily expression, but something underneath it, something that had been waiting a long time. "I understand if that changes things between us in a way that makes the current arrangement untenable. I will not make it, Eliza," he said. She stopped. "I have been in love with you since the morning in October when you told Griggs exactly what that pipe cost, and I couldn't decide whether to admire you or be quietly afraid of you, and I decided eventually that both were the right answer." She looked at him. He looked at her. And then she was across the room and he was standing and he was very large and very warm and very real. And when he put his arms around her, she felt the full breadth and solidity of him, all that mountain strength drawn carefully, deliberately around her, not to contain, not to diminish, but to shelter. And there was a difference she had not fully believed in before that moment. He kissed her for the first time, unhurried and certain, and it was nothing like the kisses she had been given by a man who was always in a hurry to get to the next thing. It was a kiss that had time in it. It was a kiss that knew it was not the last one. She pulled back just far enough to breathe and looked up at him and said, "I want to do this properly." "What does properly look like?" he asked, and his voice had dropped to something low and private that she felt in her chest. "It looks like us being sure," she said, "and taking time to be sure, and me not jumping from one disaster into another just because you are the opposite of everything that was a disaster." He tucked a strand of her auburn hair behind her ear with one of those large, careful hands. "I'm not going anywhere," he said. "I'll be here when you're sure." "I'm already sure," she said. "I just want us to do it right." "Then we'll do it right," he said. February in Wyoming was its own country, a white and brutal and beautiful country with rules that had nothing to do with the rules of anywhere else. Eliza and Colt moved through it with the deliberateness they had both agreed on, which meant evenings together and conversation that went deeper than it had before, and the slow accumulation of knowing someone not in the urgent careening way of young passion, but in the settled, thorough way of two people who had both learned the cost of not paying attention. She learned that he had a temper, not the dangerous kind, not the kind that scared her, but a real one, present and honest, that showed itself when something was genuinely unjust. She saw it when a man in the saloon made a comment about the Chinese laborers who were working the lower mine tunnels for a fraction of what the white workers received, a comment designed to elicit agreement from the room, and Colt said quietly, "Those men work as hard as any man in this territory, and they're paid like they're worth less than their tools. That's not something to joke about." The room had gone quiet. The man had looked at Colt for a long, measuring moment and then found something very interesting to look at on the ceiling. She learned that he could be stubborn. They disagreed on one occasion about how the ledger system for the wood-selling operation should be organized. He was doing it one way, she could see a better way, and they had an argument about it that was spirited and direct and not particularly friendly for about 20 minutes. And then he had looked at her system and said, "Yours is better." And that had been the end of it, and she had found the whole episode oddly exhilarating. She learned that he dreamed about Tennessee sometimes and woke in the dark with the particular disorientation of someone who has traveled too far from where they began. She knew this because on one occasion, coming up late from the kitchen, she heard him through his door, not words, just the sound of a man surfacing from somewhere deep. And she had stood in the hall for a moment and then gone to her room and lain awake thinking about all the distances people carried inside them. She learned that he was, beneath everything, lonely in the same way she was, not the social loneliness of someone who needed company, but the specific loneliness of a person whose interior life was large and had not found adequate reflection anywhere. She recognized it perfectly because she had lived in it for years, and when she talked to him, really talked to him, about ideas, about the world, about the things she observed and thought about and had never had anyone to say to, the relief in his face was so immediate and so unguarded that it moved her every time. He told her, on a February evening when they were walking the snow-packed Main Street after dinner, because they had both developed the habit of an evening walk regardless of temperature, that he had not planned to stay in Clearwater Crossing after the timber contract was complete. She stopped walking. "And now?" she asked. He looked down the street at the lights in the saloon windows, the thin smoke rising from a dozen chimneys into the black sky. "Now I'm wondering whether a man with a timber operation 12 miles up the mountain could make a reasonable case for setting up something more permanent in a town that's going to need more building as the mine expands." He looked at her. "Depending on whether there are things in the town worth staying for." "That's a very careful way of asking a question," she said. "I am a careful man." "Colt?" "Eliza." "Stay," she said. Just that. One word with everything in it. He looked at her for a long, still moment in the cold February air, and then he nodded, once, and she threaded her arm through his, and they walked the rest of the street, and she was warmer than the temperature had any right to make her. March arrived with the thaw, which in the Absarokas was a dramatic and sometimes violent event. The snowmelt came down the mountain in torrents, the access roads turned to rivers, and the town existed for 2 weeks in a state of productive chaos, fixing winter damage, reopening supply lines, bringing in the goods that hadn't made it through December and January. The mine reopened. Colt's timber contract resumed, and he was back to long days on the mountain, which Eliza managed with the same equanimity she managed everything, except that the evenings when he came back had developed a quality she had not had to account for previously, which was that she was glad to see him in a way that was entirely specific to him. He proposed to her in April. She had been expecting it, in the way you could tell a season was changing before it announced itself, but when it actually happened, it was not how she had expected it. He did not do it at dinner or during an evening walk. He did it on a Tuesday morning when she was in the vegetable garden behind the boarding house, which she was preparing for the spring planting, kneeling in the dirt with her gloves and her trowel, very much not in any state she would have chosen for such a moment. He came through the gate from the stable, still in his work coat, and stopped a few feet away and looked at her, and she looked up at him, and he said, "I want to spend the rest of my life making things easier for you, and I know you don't need me to, but I'd like to anyway. Will you marry me?" She sat back on her heels and looked at him. He was standing in her garden with sawdust on his coat and morning light on his face, and absolutely nothing in his expression except the open, vulnerable certainty of a man who has said exactly what he meant. "You are proposing to me while I'm in the dirt," she said. "You're not less beautiful for being in the dirt," he said. "I wasn't going to manufacture a moment. This is a real moment." She pulled off her glove and looked at her hand. She thought about Thomas Calloway and the easy, charming proposal he had made under a Missouri sky, full of beautiful promises that were worth nothing because they had been made by a man who did not know how to keep them. She thought about everything she had built in the 3 years since. She thought about the pine bough brooch and the fixed stovepipe and the cat on the roof and a Tuesday morning in a garden. "Yes," she said, "I will marry you." He crossed the garden in 2 strides and took her hands, dirty gloves and all, and held them. And she stood and he bent his head to hers, and the morning was very bright and very still and smelled of turned earth and new spring. They were married in June. It was a simple wedding, conducted by Brother Thomas in the small church, attended by the entire population of Clearwater Crossing, because in a town that size, everyone attended everything and no one required an invitation. Eliza wore a dress she made herself from a blue-gray fabric she had ordered from the catalog, which was the closest thing to finery she felt comfortable with, and she wore both brooches at her collar, the blue glass one for her mother and the pine bough one for him. Colt wore his best coat and had cut his hair slightly, just enough to demonstrate effort, and he stood at the front of the church with the calm solidity he brought to everything. And when she walked down the aisle and he saw her, the expression that crossed his face was one she would carry with her for the rest of her life, complete, undefended, incandescent. The ceremony was brief because Brother Thomas was economical with his words, and afterward there was a gathering at the boarding house where everyone brought food, and Dutch gave a toast that was surprisingly coherent, and Mr. Hopper cried, which surprised everyone, and Miss Fenwick spilled punch on herself in her excitement, and then laughed at herself in a way Eliza had never seen from her before, which was the best possible thing. Late in the evening, when the guests had thinned and the fire was burning low, Colt sat beside her on the front porch of the boarding house, the porch that still leaned slightly left but had never fallen, and put his arm around her, and she leaned into the broad, warm wall of him, and they looked at the main street of Clearwater Crossing, quiet now under a June sky that was the color of a bruise turning to a sunset. "Well," she said. "Well," he said. She tilted her head up to look at him. "I don't do things halfway," she said. "You should know that going in." "I know it going in," he said. "It is the best thing about you among considerable competition. And you are going to continue to infuriate me about the ledger system. My way is also a reasonable way. Your way is charming but wrong." He laughed, a real laugh, full and unhurried, the kind she had come to think of as exclusively hers because she was the only one who ever drew it out of him. "I love you, Eliza Bridger," he said. She felt the name settle over her. Not the loss of the old one, which had meant survival and self-making, and which she would always honor, but the addition of this new one, freely chosen. "I love you," she said. "It terrifies me only slightly less than it did in February." "That's progress," he said. "I am a work in progress," she agreed. "So am I." They sat on the porch until the stars were out in full, and the mountain above the town was dark against a darker sky, and Clearwater Crossing was as quiet as it ever got, which was not very quiet at all, and it was exactly right. The first year of their marriage was lived, appropriately, in the boarding house. There had been some discussion about whether Colt should move his operation down from the mountain and whether Eliza should give up the boarding house, and the discussion had lasted approximately one evening before they both recognized that neither of those things made any sense. The boarding house was a going concern with a good reputation and a steady income, and it was hers in a way that had nothing to do with him and everything to do with what she had built, and he would no more ask her to give it up than he would ask her to stop breathing. His timber operation on the north slope was expanding, now that the mine was hiring more workers and more shoring was needed, and he was talking about taking on a second cutting crew, which would mean a proper operation with proper accounts, accounts which Eliza redesigned entirely on a single Saturday morning, producing a ledger system so clear and comprehensive that Colt looked at it for a long moment and said, "I am going to tell everyone this was my idea." "You absolutely are not," she said. She continued her campaign against Griggs's pricing disparities, and she expanded it. She had started with quiet efficiency, keeping records for several of the mine workers who couldn't do so themselves, noting their hours, their contracted rates, the deductions that Hadwick applied, and the amounts they actually received. She brought these records to the county office in the spring when the circuit judge was in town, not with drama but with documentation, and the judge looked at her organized, meticulous ledger pages, and then at Hadwick's own records, which had the smudged, uncomfortable look of numbers that had not expected to be questioned, and the outcome was that 12 workers received back wages totaling more than the operating cost of Griggs's entire hardware inventory for a quarter. Hadwick was not pleased. He made his displeasure known in the way powerful men in small towns made displeasure known, through the social temperature, through comments dropped at the right tables, through the suggestion that a woman running a boarding house had no business in mine operations. Eliza was entirely unmoved by this, having been managed by the social temperature her entire life, and having developed a very high tolerance for it. Colt, for his part, had a conversation with Hadwick that he described to Eliza afterward as businesslike, which she suspected was a characterization that contained considerable compression. Hadwick did not make further comments about her business. She did not object to what Colt had done. She might have, once, might have felt the sharp protective impulse of a woman who has had to fight every battle alone and has learned to feel interference as threat. But she had come to understand the difference between someone taking over and someone having your back, and Colt Bridger never took over. He stood behind her, large and immovable, while she fought her own fights, and that was an entirely different thing. In November of their first year together, she knew she was expecting their child. She told him on a Sunday morning. She had been sitting with it for 2 weeks, turning it over, checking and rechecking against the evidence the way she checked everything against evidence, before she was certain. He was at the breakfast table reading, and she sat down across from him and folded her hands on the table and waited for him to look up. He looked up. "We're going to have a child," she said. The book went down. He looked at her with an expression that moved through several territories in quick succession, something that might have been shock, and then something vast and warm and undone. He reached across the table and covered her folded hands with one of his. He did not speak for a moment. "Are you well?" he asked, the first question. Not about his own feelings, not about plans or futures. Her. "I am very well," she said. "I'm in good health. I've spoken to Doc Reeves." He exhaled slowly, like a man letting go of something he had been holding braced. "Good," he said. He turned her hands over and looked at them, her strong, capable hands in his large ones. "A child," he said, tasting the word. "A child," she confirmed, "due in the spring." He raised his eyes to hers, and what was in them then was so full and so unguarded that she had to breathe through it. "I'm going to build you a house," he said. She laughed, a genuine, surprised laugh. "We have a house. We have a boarding house full of other people. I am going to build you a house." He said it with the absolute calm conviction of a man announcing a geological fact. "On the west end of town, where the lot is larger, with a proper garden, and a room that is just for you, for your accounts and your work." She looked at him. "That's a very large project for a man who also runs a timber operation." "It is," he said. "I expect to be deeply tired for approximately a year." She leaned across the table and kissed him, and he cupped her face in his big hands, and they stayed like that for a long, quiet moment in the morning kitchen while the stove ticked and the town began to wake outside. He built the house. He built it with the same unhurried thoroughness he brought to everything, working on it in the hours before and after the timber operation, through the rest of November and December, and into January, with the help of 2 men from his cutting crew who he paid in timber and meals. Eliza visited the site regularly, not to supervise. She knew better than to supervise a man who knew exactly what he was doing, but because she found the process of watching it rise fascinating. The transformation of a lot of dirt and air into walls and rooms and a roof, that would not go anywhere in a Wyoming wind. The room he built for her, the room just for her accounts and work, had a window facing south for the light and a built-in desk with proper deep drawers and shelves along one wall that she could fill with the records and ledgers that had always, until now, been spread across the boarding house sitting room table. When she walked into that room for the first time, on a January afternoon when the framing was done and the walls were up and the window was in, she stood very still in the middle of it and felt something move through her that she would have described, if pressed, as the feeling of being seen so completely that there was nothing left to hide. She went and found Colt in the main room, where he was checking the chimney draw, and she put her arms around him from behind, which required reaching around a considerable amount of man, and she pressed her face against his back and said nothing for a moment. "All right?" he asked. "More than all right," she said. "Thank you." He turned and gathered her in, careful with her as he had been increasingly careful over these months, and she rested her head against his chest and heard his heart beat, steady and slow, and felt the child move for the first time, just a flutter, just a whisper. And she laughed and pressed his hand to the place. He went completely still. "There," she said. He held his hand flat against her, and she watched his face, and what was on it was so pure and so open that she understood she was watching a man encounter something that had broken him open in the best possible way, something that had gotten past every wall he had built over years alone on a mountain, every defensive layer of self-sufficiency and isolation. She watched him fall in love with someone he had not yet met, and it was among the most beautiful things she had ever seen. "Hello," he said quietly to the place under his hand. She covered his hand with hers, and they stood in the half-built room in January light and were, together, full. The baby came in April, as she had said it would, because Eliza Calloway Bridger made accurate predictions. And it was a boy. He came into the world with considerable opinion and a full head of dark hair and the set jaw that everyone in the room recognized immediately. And when Colt held him for the first time, this enormous man with this small, fierce person in his arms, there was a stillness in the room that was different from ordinary quiet, the stillness of something significant being established. "He looks like you," Eliza said from the bed, tired and entirely present. "He has your mouth," Colt said, not looking up from the baby's face. "He's going to argue with everyone." "He's going to be thorough and fair," she corrected. "Those are the same thing in your vocabulary." She laughed, which hurt and didn't care. They named him Henry, for no particular reason except that when they said it, it fit. Henry Thomas Bridger arrived in the spring of 1876 in the town of Clearwater Crossing, Wyoming, and was received by his mother with fierce, exhausted love, and by his father with a gentleness that no one who had only known Colt Bridger by his size would have predicted, and by the other residents of the former boarding house, now capably managed by a young woman named Clara Dent, whom Eliza had hired and trained, with the excitement that a small community gave to every new person, because every person was significant when the numbers were small. The new house on the west end of town was ready by the time Henry was 2 months old, and Eliza moved into it with the same efficiency she applied to everything, and arranged the south-facing office room on the first afternoon, and stood in the kitchen of her own house. Not a house she had inherited, not a house built on obligation, but a house built for her by a man who had paid attention, and felt the particular completeness of a life that had found its proper shape. The boarding house continued under Clara, with Eliza's supervision and accounts. Her record-keeping work for the mine workers had expanded into something that might fairly be called an unofficial service. Women and men who needed help with contracts, with accounts, with the particular vulnerabilities of doing business in a territory where literacy and legal knowledge were unevenly distributed, and the powerful were accustomed to operating without oversight. She charged a modest fee where she could, and charged nothing where she couldn't. And she kept the ledgers on her own sliding scale with the same rigorous honesty she brought to everything. And the south-facing office room filled gradually with the organized, meticulous record of a community being made more fair. Colt expanded the timber operation that same year, taking on the second cutting crew he had been planning, and the business grew in the steady compounding way of a well-run enterprise in an expanding territory. He was away on the mountain 4 days most weeks and home for 3, and those 3 days had a quality she had not known to want, and now could not imagine without. He came back on Thursday evenings, always, and she cooked dinner that was more elaborate than the usual weeknight, not because she needed to perform anything, but because she liked doing it, liked the specific pleasure of feeding someone who was genuinely glad to be home. Henry adored him with the complete, uncomplicated devotion that small children gave the parent who was slightly larger than their whole world. Colt read to him every evening when he was home, sitting in the chair by the fire with Henry tucked against his chest, this tiny, dark-haired person against that enormous chest. And Eliza sat across from them with her accounts and listened to the cadence of her husband's voice reading stories. And it was the single most consistently contenting thing in her life, this ordinary domestic miracle of her two favorite people in the same room. Dutch found silver in his claim in the autumn of 1876, which everyone had agreed was impossible, and which Dutch met with such exuberant celebration that he spent 3 nights in the saloon, and then came to the boarding house and knocked on Eliza's door, not the boarding house, the new house, at an unseemly hour to share the news, which she received with more patience than was perhaps warranted given the hour. He sold the claim for enough money to live on for a decade if he was careful, which he never would be, and left Clearwater Crossing for San Francisco, which was exactly where Dutch belonged. He gave Eliza a tearful embrace on his way out of town and told her she was the best person he had ever met, excepting possibly his own mother, and she told him she hoped he would be well. And she meant it. Mr. Hopper passed quietly in his sleep in the winter of 1876, which was mourned by the town and especially by Clara, who had developed a genuine affection for the old man and his pipe tobacco and his maps. He left his collection of surveying maps to the town, which Eliza arranged to have donated to the county land office, which seemed like what he would have wanted. Miss Fenwick, having spent 2 years working up to it, finally told the young telegraph operator named Aldrich that she had feelings for him, and he told her he had been waiting for her to say so since the previous spring, and they were married in the same small church where Eliza and Colt had married, and Eliza attended and watched Fenwick walk toward Aldrich with the careful, terrified joy of someone taking a leap they'd been standing at the edge of for too long, and felt a tenderness for her that she would not have predicted from the early days of their acquaintance. Brother Thomas remained, quiet and regular and prompt with rent, and eventually became a permanent figure of the town in the way that certain people become fixed in a place like features of the landscape. He performed weddings and funerals and the occasional service that was more philosophical than religious, and he and Eliza had several conversations over the years that she found genuinely illuminating, which surprised her, as she had expected nothing from a preacher. In 1877, when Henry was 1 year old and sturdy and opinionated, and beginning the process of walking with a determination that suggested he would not tolerate any delays in this project, Eliza discovered she was expecting again. She told Colt in the same kitchen on a Sunday morning, the same way she had told him the first time. He looked up from his coffee and she watched him read her face, and the warmth that came into his was immediate. "Another one," he said. "Another one," she confirmed. "In the spring again, I think." He got up from the table. She was always somewhat amazed by the way he moved through a room, the way you had to account for his size, and somehow the room always seemed to accommodate it. And he took her face in his hands and kissed her forehead. "Are you well?" "I'm very well," she said. "Stop asking the same first question every time." "It is always the first relevant question," he said. "I will always be well," she said, "and if I am not, I will tell you. I am not a woman who conceals important information." "You are not," he agreed. "It is occasionally inconvenient." She laughed and he held her, and Henry, who had pulled himself upright against the kitchen table and was watching this development with great interest, said something that was not yet a word but was intended as commentary, and they both looked at him and then at each other and laughed. The second child was a girl. She arrived in April of 1878, also with dark hair, also with considerable opinion, and with her mother's green eyes, which were apparent immediately, and which made Colt look at Eliza with an expression she found difficult to describe, except as reverent. "She has your eyes," he said. "She does," Eliza agreed, holding the baby, who was already looking around the room with the focused intensity of someone taking inventory. "She is going to be formidable," he said. "She's going to be thorough and fair," Eliza said, in the same tone she had used about Henry. Those are still the same thing. They named her May, for no particular reason, except that it was a simple, clear name that seemed to suit her, and she grew into it with the authority of someone who had always known exactly who she was. Henry received May with the initially suspicious, ultimately devoted reaction of a 2-year-old confronted with a competitor who is smaller than him, but seems to command all the attention. Within 6 weeks, he had established himself as her chief protector, which Colt found enormously amusing, and Eliza found entirely predictable, given who the boy's father was. The years moved through Clearwater Crossing with the particular pace of the frontier, fast in the summer, slow in the deep winter, marked by the rhythms of mining and planting and harvest, and the steady accumulation of small events that constituted a life. The mine expanded, and the town expanded with it, and new buildings went up along the main street, and new families arrived, and it was no longer quite the hardscrabble collection of timber frames and ambition. It had been in 1874, but was becoming something more deliberate, a town with intentions. Colt's timber operation grew to become the primary supplier for the expanded mine, and he took on a foreman, a capable young man named Garrett, who he had hired off a cattle drive and trained, which freed him from the mountain more regularly and meant he was home not 3 days a week, but 4, and sometimes 5. He built an office beside the house for the business accounts, which sat next to Eliza's office like a conversation, and they sometimes worked in their respective rooms in the evenings and called back and forth through the open doors about figures and schedules, which was nothing like what either of them had imagined their lives would look like, but was, by any honest assessment, perfect. Eliza's advocacy work, she had started calling it that privately, though she would never have called it anything so grand publicly, had developed an informal reputation that extended beyond Clearwater Crossing. Twice in 1878 and 3 times in 1879, people came from other settlements in the territory specifically to find her, having heard through the communication networks of people without power that she was someone who knew how to make numbers argue on your behalf. She took their cases with the same thoroughness she gave everything, and she won more than she lost, and the ones she lost she documented so carefully that the loss itself became a kind of argument for the next attempt. She was 32 in 1879, and she looked at herself in the mirror with the clear and practical eye she turned on everything, and she saw a woman who was tired from good work and full from good love, and rooted in a place that was hers in every way. A place could be someone's. And she thought, I could not have imagined this. Not this specifically. Not the south-facing room and the 2 dark-haired children and the mountain man in the chair by the fire reading stories. Not the way it felt to be loved by someone who understood the difference between sheltering and containing. She had not imagined it because she had stopped imagining in the years after Thomas Calloway, and now she was here in the life she had not let herself imagine, and it was not a fairy story. It had difficulty and disagreement and hard winters and impossible ledgers and moments of fear and the ordinary grinding work of running a family and a business and a small community advocacy in a frontier territory that did not always want to be organized. But it was real, and it was hers, and it was shared with a man who had loved her the way you loved something you intended to keep, not possessively, not conditionally, but with the deep patient certainty of someone who had chosen deliberately and would go on choosing every day without drama or fanfare. The summer of 1879 was warm and long, and in July, Colt took a week away from the timber operation, the first full week he had taken since they were married, and they went up the mountain together, all 4 of them, camping in the high country above the tree line where the Absarokas opened into meadows that no calendar of civilization had reached. Henry was 3 and splendidly feral in the way 3-year-old boys were designed to be, and May was 17 months and very much over being carried, and very much under the age of reliable independent locomotion, which created a logistical situation that Colt managed with the equanimity he brought to all logistical situations, which generally involved holding the baby in one arm and directing the 3-year-old with the other, and somehow still managing the horses. Eliza sat on a rock on the second evening of that camping trip and watched the sunset paint the Wyoming sky in colors that had no equivalent anywhere else, orange and rose and a particular deep gold that seemed to originate from inside the light itself, and watched her husband come up the slope toward her with May asleep against his chest and Henry trotting beside him chattering about a chipmunk he had seen, and the mountains behind them dark and snow-capped and eternal. And she felt something so complete that it had no words she knew. He sat beside her on the rock, and she leaned into him and he put his free arm around her, careful not to wake May, and Henry wedged himself between them with the ruthless efficiency of a small child who will not be excluded from comfort, and they all sat on the rock and watched the light change over the Absaroka Range. "Do you ever miss Tennessee?" she asked. He thought about it, genuinely, as he always did. "Sometimes," he said, "when it's hot and the air smells a certain way. The hills there are different, softer." He looked at the mountains. "But I think I was always meant for hard country." She looked at him. "You were always meant to build things," she said. He looked at her, and there it was, the expression that was hers alone, full and unguarded and entirely sure. "Yes," he said simply. "So was I," she said. He kissed her hair, and the sun continued its work on the sky, and Henry announced that he wanted to see more chipmunks, and May made a small, contented sound in her sleep, and the moment was complete in every direction, past and future, folded into a single present that contained everything it needed. In the autumn of that year, Eliza received a letter. It came through the post on a Tuesday, addressed in handwriting she did not immediately recognize, and she opened it in her office and read it, standing, which she sometimes did when she was in the middle of other things. Then she read it again, sitting. It was from a woman in Laramie, a widow named Ruth Greenwood, who had heard about Eliza's work with the mine workers and the documented wage disputes, and who was writing to ask whether Eliza would be willing to come to Laramie to assist with a case involving a group of laundry workers, women mostly, who were owed significant unpaid wages by a hotel operation. The case was larger than anything Eliza had taken on before. The documentation would require weeks of work. It was in another city. She sat with the letter for a day. When Colt came home on Thursday evening, she handed it to him over dinner, after the children were in bed. He read it, setting down his fork to give it his full attention. He read it twice the way she had. "This is important," he said. "It is," she said. "It would take you away for several weeks." "Yes." He looked at her. "What do you need from me?" She felt the question land in her chest with the familiar warmth of a man who had never once, in all their years together, framed her choices as things to be permitted or denied, but only as things to be supported or navigated. "I need you to hold things together here," she said. "The children, the house. Clara can manage the boarding house, but—" "I'll be here," he said. "Go to Laramie. Do what you do." He paused. "Take your best ledgers." "I always take my best ledgers," she said. "I know," he said. "I love you." "I love you," she said. "I will write every other day. I will write back when I can, which will not be every other day because I have 2 children and a timber operation and the boarding house to look after. But I will write." She went to Laramie in October, and she was gone for 3 weeks, and she missed him with a specific daily ache that was entirely different from the loneliness she had lived with before she knew him. Not hollow, but full of something, full of him and the home they had made and the life she was going back to. She wrote every other day. He wrote 4 times, which was 4 times more than she had expected from a man who used 10 words where others used 40. And each letter was concise and direct and held everything she needed. The children were well, the house was standing, he missed her. Henry had asked when she was coming home at least twice daily. May had pulled herself upright against the sitting room chair and stood unassisted for 11 seconds. She won the Laramie case. She came home on a Saturday afternoon, and the house was cleaner than she had left it, which was a mystery she chose not to investigate. And Henry ran at her from the front gate with the total velocity of a small person for whom containment was a theoretical concept. And she caught him and held him, and he said, "Mama, you were gone for 100 years. And she said, 3 weeks, which is not 100 years. And he said, it felt like 100 years, which was so entirely her son that she laughed until she had to sit down on the front step. Colt came out of the house behind him, and May was on his hip, and May was also attempting to launch herself toward Eliza with a determination that exceeded her physical coordination. And Colt managed the transfer and stood looking at Eliza holding both children, and his expression was the full, quiet, certain one she had married. And he said nothing for a moment. Then he said, "You won." "I won," she said. He sat on the step beside her and put his arm around her, and the children reorganized themselves between them and on top of them and around them in the chaotic, comfortable way children occupied every space available. And the afternoon sun was warm on the front step, and the mountains stood above the town, steady and permanent and blue-white with the first October snow. "Tell me everything," he said. She told him everything. They sat on the front step until the October cold drove them inside, and then they sat by the fire, and she talked and he listened with the full, deep attention that had always been one of the things she loved most about him. And the children fell asleep on the rug in front of the fire, Henry on his back with his arms thrown wide as though he had simply surrendered to sleep in the middle of some urgent project, and May curled against him with the trust of a younger sibling who has correctly identified the available comfort. Colt looked at them, then at her. "We made good people," he said. "We are still making them," she said. "They are unfinished." "So are we," he said. She looked at him. This man, this enormous, patient, gentle, steadfast man who had ridden into Clearwater Crossing in October of 1874 with a dead elk and a timber contract, and had proceeded, over months and years, to prove with absolute consistency that her trust was not the dangerous thing she had believed it to be, but simply a resource that had been given to the wrong person, and that given to the right person, it returned, compounded. "So are we," she agreed. "And I think that's the best news I know." He reached across and took her hand, her strong, capable, ink-stained hand, and held it the way he had held it 100 times before, and would hold it 1,000 times hence, with the comfortable certainty of a man who had made his choice and made it again every day, and would go on making it without drama or condition for as long as he had breath. Outside, the Absaroka Mountains stood in the October dark, the same mountains that had watched her arrive in Clearwater Crossing 3 years before Thomas Calloway, 2 brooches and a ledger and a determination to trust no one, and watched her now, in 1879, in this house on the west end of town with the south-facing office room and the front step that did not lean, with her children sleeping by the fire and her husband's hand in hers and the evidence of a life that had been built rather than found, chosen rather than fallen into, earned by the very same willingness that had once made her so afraid. She had been done trusting anyone with her heart. She was glad she had tried again. She was glad it had been him.